Welcome to History 4314. I'm Stephen Mintz, and today we're going to talk about racial, ethnic, religious, and gender stereotyping in film. Back in 1988, the biggest issue in the presidential campaign was, of all things, the Pledge of Allegiance. And it's hard to believe that the biggest issue of the 2000 presidential campaign was anti-Catholicism. Recently, there has been a great deal of public outrage about the anti-Catholic views of Bob Jones University and of fundamentalist religious leaders who denounce the Pope as the Antichrist. But in fact, most of the anti-Catholic sentiment in the United States does not come from Bob Jones University. Rather, it comes from film and cable television, more from those sources than any place else. Let me just give you a few examples of some recent films that some of you have probably seen. You might recall the film Dogma. It starred Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, two of Hollywood's biggest stars. They portray fallen angels. Alanis Morissette is God. Comedian Chris Rock plays the 13th disciple who has been excised from the Bible because he was black. Mary and Joseph, the film suggests, might have had sex after Jesus' birth, and now, centuries later, one of their direct descendants, played by Linda Fiorentino, works at an abortion clinic. The comedian George Carlin is a New Jersey cardinal who devises a church public relations campaign called Catholicism Wow, in which a crucifix, a very depressing image, would be replaced by a winking, thumbs up, your buddy Jesus. But that's not the only example of Hollywood depictions of Catholicism. Another film, Stigmata, suggested that a cardinal was on a Vatican-sanctioned mission to silence by any means possible a woman receiving divine messages. Stigmata casts the Vatican as an international nexus of evil, radiating out to all parts of the globe, sort of like Spectre in the old James Bond films, with the nefarious Prince of the Church as Dr. No. The Omega Code comes along with only two notable Catholic characters. One of them turns out to be the Antichrist, and the other is a murdering ex-priest lackey. This is all a very far cry from the older treatment of Catholicism in Hollywood, when the good guys were played by Spencer Tracy or Pat O'Brien or Bing Crosby. Back in the 1930s, one wit defined Hollywood this way: a Jewish-owned business selling Roman Catholic theology to Protestant America. But no one thinks that now. Anti-Catholic animus has deep roots in American culture. Some dates back to the Reformation of the 16th century, when the Protestant reformers denounced the church as riddled by corruption. And that's the anti-Catholicism that Bob Jones University harks back to. But most modern anti-Catholicism does not date back to the 16th century. It dates back rather to the 18th and 19th centuries, when the thinkers of the Enlightenment and Protestant nativists developed a host of new arguments against the Church. They maintained that the Catholic Church was an authoritarian monolith, that its doctrines were hopelessly pre-modern, that its rites were colorless but mindless, that its sexual standards were unnatural, repressive, and hypocritical, that its congregations were anti-Semitic and racist, that its priests were harsh and predatory, that its grip on the minds of believers was numbing. To be sure, Hollywood did make many movies that portrayed Catholicism in a positive light. Perhaps you've seen Going My Way or The Bells of St. Mary's. And yet, there's an astonishing lack of awareness in modern American culture about how prevalent anti-Catholic stereotypes are in the movies. American culture is a maelstrom of prejudices and stereotypes, some of which are expressed only in private, but others are allowed in the mass media. Some of these stereotypes are lethal. We'll talk about some of those as our class goes on, but most are merely corrosive. Anti-Catholicism does not keep Catholics out of boardrooms. It does not keep them out of country clubs. But it does harm Catholics nonetheless. So let me just briefly go through some of the stereotypes, some of the caricatures that permeate modern films. Recently, the Catholic Church has become a kind of command central for sinister intrigue. Its priests, objects of caricature and insult. It's difficult to imagine another religion whose iconography, rituals, and priesthood could be so casually demolished on the screen. Today, for at least some filmmakers, Catholicism is less a religion than a ready-made soundstage for horror films and conspiracy thrillers, a creepy cult devoted to blood-soaked rituals, child sex abuse, and the greatest perversion of all in contemporary American culture, that is, celibacy. A clerical collar, once the sign of protection and reassurance, is now more readily depicted by Hollywood as the mark of a scoundrel. In the 1996 thriller Primal Fear, a murdered archbishop is exposed as a pervert who forces altar boys to perform sex acts for his amusement. Or take a more recent example, the popular television show The Sopranos. The lustful weasel who ministers to the family's spiritual needs certainly qualifies as a criminal character. Anti-Catholicism is merely one of the kinds of ethnic stereotyping that are an integral part of the movies. And in today's class, I'm sure I'm going to make you all flinch a bit because we're going to be looking at a wide range of ethnic stereotyping, religious stereotyping, racial stereotyping that you're going to see is deeply implanted in the movies. Movies are teachers, but they don't just teach us knowledge. They also teach us stereotypes, preconceptions, and prejudices. And so in today's class, we're going to be looking at the ugly side of the movies. But first, we have to end up with our last topic from last week, and that is the status and treatment of women in film. So let's complete that discussion. We ended up with Marilyn Monroe and her many imitators, and one question that we asked was, how can we explain Marilyn Monroe's status as a cultural icon? Why has she so persisted in American culture decades after her death? Any thoughts? Why has she become the most popular and enduring cinematic image of womanhood? Yes?
Because she's come to be not only a sex symbol, but also just a symbol of the era, of an earlier time, of maybe a simpler time, that sort of thing?
Okay, one of the people who runs this show actually had, I thought, a very interesting image, a very interesting explanation. And that is that Marilyn Monroe encapsulated in herself all the images of womanhood that we've been talking about. That is, she was both the child woman and she was the sex goddess. She was the vamp and she was the childhood innocent. She, perhaps inadvertently, perhaps consciously, was able to combine in herself the various elements that had defined womanhood in Hollywood for more than half a century. Now, there was another role, apart from mammary madness, that was very popular in the post-war era, and that's the role of daddy's little girl, the precocious teen. She was usually played by Debbie Reynolds or Natalie Wood or Tuesday Weld or Leslie Caron or Audrey Hepburn. They played girls, but different girls than Shirley Temple or Judy Garland. They were pretty, they were amusing, they were childish, and they aroused enormous appeal among teen fans. On the eve of the 1960s, Debbie Reynolds' brand of femininity would be usurped by an even younger heroine, Sandra Dee, now teetered on the fine line between 50s innocence and naivete and the 60s sex nymphette. In 1959, she was the top, she hit the box office top 10 with two films, A Summer Place and Gidget, films that many of you have seen, or at least you've seen the TV show Takeoff on Gidget. Definitions of womanhood had become very rigid by the end of the 1950s. It's hard for us today to imagine how angry and bitter the public was, or at least the mass media was, when Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton fell in love while filming Cleopatra. A Georgia congresswoman called on the Attorney General to take measures necessary to see that the two were ineligible for re-entry into the country on the grounds of undesirability. It's hard to imagine Congress people doing that now. It's a time when the courts refused a pregnant married woman the right to an abortion, even though she had taken the drug thalidomide during her pregnancy. It was a time when the president of Vassar College told students wishing to indulge in premarital sex or alcohol that they must withdraw from school. The University of Connecticut threatened punitive measures against students guilty of, quote, uncontrolled public displays of affection, by which they meant kissing. And in 1964, a Cleveland woman was arrested for giving birth control information to her own teenage daughter. We're talking about a world that seems not just 30 or 40 years in the past. It seems literally to be 2 or 3 generations in the past. And that is the context in which the most popular theme in the movies was the question of will she or won't she? In Come September, Rock Hudson advises Sandra Dee, a college student vacationing at his Italian villa with her boyfriend Bobby Darin, to remain virginal for her husband. This while his mistress, Gina Lollobrigida, is installed in the villa. In Splendor in the Grass, Natalie Wood is so torn by repressing her sexual urges that she suffers a mental breakdown. Her sweetheart, Warren Beatty, after relieving his energies with the town's loose women, proceeds to marry someone else. Now, the Carrie Nation of Hollywood's chastity crusade was the famous actress Doris Day. In film after film, she defended her chastity. She defended her virtue in movies like Pillow Talk, Lover Come Back, Touch of Mink. Often her movies end with a kind of caveman conclusion where Rock Hudson carries her off unwillingly and she capitulates to marriage. Again, you have this sense of a very different world with completely different moral sensibilities than the world we inhabit in the 21st century. And now, what we're going to do next is try to explain this. And we're going to talk about a theme that I'm going to call the symbolic annihilation of women. We're going to look at how the mass media shaped the way people saw women and how women saw themselves. And we're going to start with a story. We're going to tell the story of a woman named Betty Goldstein. Betty Goldstein had graduated #1 in her college class at Smith College. She then entered graduate school in psychology at the University of California at Berkeley, where she studied with the most famous psychologist in the nation, a man named Erik Erikson. You all know him because he's the man who invented the identity crisis, which we all have suffered from. But when she got to Berkeley, she faced a momentous dilemma because she received a large fellowship and her boyfriend asked her to turn it down. Quote, "You can take that fellowship, but you know I'll never get one like it. You know what it will do to us." So Betty was faced with a serious dilemma. Quote, "Either I pursue my career or I sublimate my wishes to a man." But she was afraid of becoming an old maid college teacher, and in the end, she decided to turn down that prestigious fellowship. And despite her sacrifice, the romance did not last, and the boyfriend left. Betty then moved to Greenwich Village. She met a man there named Carl Friedan, and after a whirlwind 7-month courtship, they married. She had 3 children. She moved to a house in the suburbs, and when the census came by to ask what she did for a living, she wrote, "housewife." Now, Betty Friedan was, of course, not unique. In her decision to drop out of graduate school and not to pursue a career, she was one of many women in the 1950s. There was a joke in the 1950s that there should be a new degree, the PhD, putting husband through. After World War II, millions of women who had gone to college or joined the workforce returned to being full-time housewives and mothers. So why didn't women who had worked during World War II in record numbers, why didn't women continue to work? Why didn't they continue to pursue educations? Why didn't they continue to pursue careers? Why did post-war women place so much emphasis on home and family? Why did birth rates double in the 1950s? Why, for the only decade in the 20th century, did divorce rates stabilize in the 1950s? Why did the average age of marriage fall to less than 20 in the 1950s? Well, Betty Friedan would try to answer that question in a book she called The Feminine Mystique, which was published in 1963. And this book is one of the most influential books in all of American history. What Harriet Beecher Stowe did for slaves in Uncle Tom's Cabin, what Jacob Riis did for the urban poor in How the Other Half Lives, what Upton Sinclair did for public health in The Jungle, what Rachel Carson did for the environment in Silent Spring, what Ralph Nader did for consumers in Unsafe at Any Speed, that's what Betty Friedan would do for women with The Feminine Mystique. Together with other feminists, she would found the National Organization for Women to press for reform, and she would donate the royalties from The Feminine Mystique to that cause. Now, what did she argue in The Feminine Mystique? Her argument can be summarized this way. She argued that during the 1950s, the mass media, magazines, radio, television, and the movies, the mass media worked in concert to push women back into the home. That these institutions of opinion helped to stage a reaction against the transformations and upheavals of World War II. She argued that during the post-war period, the mass media sent powerful messages about what women should dream of and what women should accomplish. And she called this new ideal the feminine mystique. And that is the idea that women should find total fulfillment as wife and mother, and that they should despise women who wanted to pursue careers or who wanted to enter a profession. And what her book does is looks at how various parts of the mass media repeatedly sent out this message. Let's begin with stories in women's magazines. In the past, women in a magazine story had a career. And if she held on to her dreams, she could have both marriage and a career. So if you look at the women's magazines of the 1930s and 1940s, they may not have painted an accurate or realistic picture of women's lives, but they did clearly set out ideals. But beginning in the 1950s, a new kind of heroine appeared. She was young, she was frivolous, she was almost childlike, she was fluffy and feminine, she was passive, she was content in a world of the bedroom and the kitchen, a world of sex, babies, and the home. The new woman did not work except for housework and keeping herself beautiful. Now, why or how did this change take place? Well, the editors actually replaced the writers in the 1950s. Instead of having stories written by women writers, increasingly in the 1950s, women's magazines used male writers. Or let's take a second example. Let's take a look at fashion. During the 1940s, the most popular style involved a boyish or a mannish look for women. And if you look at Katharine Hepburn in the movies, or you look at magazine advertisements, you will see that women are dressed in narrow skirts, or have padded shoulders, and wear suits. They're wearing female versions of men's clothes. But this would all come to a crashing end in 1947 when a Paris designer named Christian Dior introduced what he called the new look. The new look emphasized femininity. It had narrow waistlines, which drew attention to shapely hips and a fully defined bosom. Women had to wear foundation garments to achieve the new look. The new styles would reach their extremes in baby doll fashions with cinched-in waists that set off a full bosom and bouffant skirts held out by crinoline petticoats. Toes on shoes became ever pointier. Heels became ever higher. Or take TV. Mom on TV never worked outside the home. Seldom did Mom ever have to do more than wipe a dust cloth or whip up a 3-course meal at a moment's notice. Sometimes she is competent, cool, and collected. But more often, women on TV were portrayed as dizzy, unable to drive a car, incapable of balancing a checkbook, and totally oblivious to the business world. In short, Betty Friedan argued that the media helped to stifle women's aspirations and shape women's attitudes. The mass media, she argued, reflected male rather than female ideals and aspirations. So what do you make of this? Does this sound convincing to you or not convincing to you? What do you think of her argument? How would you evaluate it? Is she right? Is she wrong? What do you think? Yes.
Well, I think at the time one of the criticisms was that she seemed to assume that the males and females had different ideals when in theory they might have had the same ideals. The women might have been perfectly content with that kind of life.
Okay, so you raise questions about the conspiracy view.
Well, I think that's, I don't. I happen to agree with her, but I think that's what one of the criticisms of the time was, that she was being divisive rather than...
Yes, please.
I think that her argument was a good one as far as white middle-class women were concerned, but that is so as far as the scope of it went. She didn't concern herself with other women.
Okay, let's go a little further with this and see what else the media taught. Media, we've tried to argue in our class, are educators, and they're sending messages which maybe the audience is hungry for, but which shape people's ideas about what is quote-unquote normal. Okay. What the media taught was that father does know best and that mother's place is in the home, and in the media women were frequently demeaned, trivialized, or simply ignored. For example, let's take prime time dramas on TV. Women made up only 32% of the characters on television, though in real life they made up 51% of the population. But not merely that, women were concentrated in a particular kind of television show, that is in comedies, and didn't appear in more serious dramas. But children's shows had even fewer women than other shows. Even on soap operas, women made up a minority of the characters and had more less important roles. Women were demeaned in other ways. They were often portrayed on TV and in the movies as victims of violence. Those women who were positively portrayed were either seeking a husband or were already married. And on TV and in the movies, women tended to be either old or very young, and there weren't very many women in the middle. In other words, what television and film do is they send out messages about the world. They look realistic, and they're designed to appear to be realistic. But it's, of course, a constructed world, and this world is very misleading. It doesn't portray the full range of women's experience. It doesn't portray the full range of women's ethnic, racial, class backgrounds. It only sends out certain images. And I think it does have powerful effects on what we consider to be normal. On children's shows, there were 3 male heroes. Excuse me, this is for all TV shows. 3 male heroes for every 1 female heroine. Crime shows, westerns, quiz programs, and network news tended to totally ignore women. To be sure, some men were portrayed in unflattering ways as unattractive, dishonest, disloyal, stingy, unkind, henpecked, and bumbling. But for the most part, men were portrayed as strong, intelligent, and fair. So let's now come to the present and see what we see now. As you know, Betty Friedan and others like Gloria Steinem helped ignite a massive feminist movement which had vast consequences for American society, especially for changing laws. But let's take a look next at the impact of feminism on American popular culture. And let's take a look at what the impact there has been. And there, I want to argue, the impact has been surprisingly ambiguous. There are, of course, martial arts and action films in which physically tough actresses now replace male protagonists. There are rape revenge films in which rapists are hunted down and killed by their victims. And there is a new version of a genre we're going to call film noir, in which powerful, murderous women destroy a succession of feeble men. And all of these genres are clearly products, one way or another, of feminism. Yet there's also another kind of figure that's been very popular in our popular culture that I'm going to call the Medusa figure. This is the woman as malevolent killer, as assertive attorney, as take no prisoners businesswoman. All of these images, I think, reflect our society's unease whenever a woman pursues masculine success. So has feminism altered the treatment of women in film? My answer is to a limited extent. A basic theme in Hollywood films is that women are fundamentally different than men. It's a message repeated again and again on the screen that women are more emotional than men, that they are more hard-hearted, that women are more submissive than men, or they are more manipulative, that women are more vulnerable to men. And I think seeing these images again and again and again does make a difference in the way we think. What do we find? There is often an evil villain who threatens a woman and a white knight, male, who comes to her rescue. A woman who deserts her children is a cold woman. Conversely, a woman redeems herself in the movies by making a choice to sacrifice a career for her children. Caretakers of children never die in the movies. Heroes are never cruel to children. They always, in the end, repent their previous attitude. Young women who are killed in horror movies are almost always sexually active. The woman who defeats the monster is always chaste. So for all that has changed in Hollywood, it is remarkable how the older sexual stereotypes persist. And of course, what's the last taboo in movies? Movie makers are constantly pressing the edges of what's possible, but in one area they are not. The last taboo is, of course, no frontal nudity for males. For all the change that has occurred in women's roles, far less change has taken place in images of masculinity. And so what we're going to do next is look at images of manhood in the movies and what kind of images we have derived from film. And before we do, we're going to take a look at some pictures through the overhead projector. We're going to look from the teens up until the present, and feel free to interrupt and tell me what kind of images that you see. The first image is of William S. Hart, one of the very first cowboy heroes. Anything strike you about him? Does he look like a real emotional sort of guy who really opens up and lays bare his deepest feelings? Is that sort of the sense you get? He's sort of Alan Alda type? What, is that the image you get from him? Stoicism. That was his image. Okay. Next we have John Barrymore. What appears to be masculine about him? What is it that strikes you as manly in his demeanor? Any thoughts? Please.
Well, he's got a serious expression on his face, and he's higher than the female, taller.
He's clearly pictured as dominant, right? Okay, the next picture is one you're familiar with. This is Rudolph Valentino in The Son of the Sheik. Again, what do you make of this? What messages does this send about masculinity? Dominance, decisiveness. He's the actor. She's passive. In this, rape is really the metaphor that they're using. Now let's take a look at a very different image. If we could have the overhead view. This is a famous Western hero, Tom Mix, in an early film. But there's something different about this picture. He is a house husband, as we might say now. And is this depicted in a serious way? Of course not. This is treated as an object of ridicule, right? He has been unmanned. Of course, he still has on his cowboy boots, but everything else suggests that he has been neutered. Okay, let's go a little further. This is Douglas Fairbanks Sr., who was really the first truly enormously popular male actor. What kind of image of masculinity does he present?
He looks very athletic and confident.
Yeah. I mean, this would be the Hollywood image. Now, here is an image that coexisted at exactly the same time, but what do you make of this? He's not dominant. He's not stoical. He's not athletic. What should we make of the chaplain image?
But everybody's laughing at him.
And while he triumphs in the end, he is a subject of pity. Okay, let's go a little further. This is first Academy Award-winning film. This is Wings. Look at this picture. Is there anything that strikes you about it? What do you see in this picture? You see Clara Bow, of course. This was the best picture. But what's odd? What strikes you as unusual in this picture? This is from the conclusion of the picture.
She's just kind of out there. It's the guys who are, engaging and talking, and she's just kind of looking off and looking like she feels awkward being there.
Yeah, there's a kind of emotional bond between them that clearly doesn't exist with her. And this is something we're going to talk about, if not today, in a later class. Okay, let's look a little further. This is from the 1930s. What kind of image of masculinity does Edward G. Robinson offer? Tough, swaggering. He may be short in stature, but he more than compensates for that with self-confidence. He's the man who fights to be somebody, right? What should we make of this image of masculinity? Is it a mere caricature? Or does it speak to something? I mean, gangster movies were about how to be a man at a time when many men felt humiliated. Okay. Here we have Clark Gable and Myrna Loy. And that's one image of Clark Gable. But of course, that's not the image we recall. Let's look at the image we recall. What's the difference between those two images? What do you think?
In the first one, he seemed to be showing much emotion toward her, but now he's all like trying to be manly. I guess you could sort of say that.
So what does manly mean then? What does it mean to be manly? What is Hollywood telling us? I mean, he's the same guy. He's a man in both pictures, but one, he's manly in a way we mean with a capital M. And the other, he isn't. So what are the characteristics of being manly that Hollywood is sending?
The suppression of emotion, not showing your feelings.
Yep, I think that's exactly right. We'll go a little further. This is Errol Flynn. It's Captain Blood. Showing off the male body, more popular in the 30s and 40s than it would be in later American films. Cary Grant, Destination Tokyo. Humphrey Bogart. This is not how he's usually depicted in his films, of course. John Garfield, Body and Soul, which is a film about boxing, as is the next picture we're going to look at. This is from The Setup with Robert Ryan. John Wayne and Montgomery Clift in Red River. Humphrey Bogart, this time with Katharine Hepburn in The African Queen. Okay, let's move ahead to images that are going to be much more recent and much more familiar to you, because these are the images that really shape, I think, our images of masculinity. Okay, what's this from? Do you happen to know offhand what picture it's from? Streetcar Named Desire. Yeah, Marlon Brando with Vivian Leigh. What image do you get of manhood here? Almost animalistic, right? much more emotional image of manhood, but also a lot less restrained than in the past. Okay, we'll see Brando again, this time in The Wild One. Now, we're beginning to see images that we really think of as familiar to us. What's the new image of manhood now being presented? Who's the ideal man?
He's a rebel.
He's a rebel. He's an outlaw. And what's the appeal? Why that image? So if Fairbanks had been Man the athlete, if Bogart was Man the stoic, and Brando is now Man the outlaw or rebel, what's the appeal? What do you think? Okay, we'll go a little further. Another image of manhood. Who's that? In the middle? James Dean, right? With Sal Mineo and with Natalie Wood. Okay, what's the appeal of James Dean? And I think it's exactly the same appeal as Leonardo DiCaprio. I mean, I think that really it's during the 50s that the icons of masculinity are really shaped for our time, and that they persist almost completely intact to our time, even though the world around us has completely changed. What's the appeal? James Dean.
He's gentle and contemplative.
And yet he's rebellious and doesn't obey the rules. He's a weird mixture. Notice he's also sort of androgynous, right? He doesn't fit the Bogart, hard-boiled image of masculinity. I mean, I think it's very interesting, but this is the image, I think, that still defines who are the really popular male actors, even though we're now talking about images that are 50 years old. Okay. Of course, the older images of masculinity persist, and they're kept alive by John Wayne more than anyone else. So James Dean coexists with these older images of manhood. Here you have Gary Cooper, tall, straight, forthright. Here we'll see James Dean again. This is from the greatest movie ever made about Texas, Giant, of course. Who's that woman? Elizabeth Taylor, yes. What do you make of this scene? What kind of guy is he? What's he doing? Yeah, he's serving her tea. Is that what a man does? Or what does it say about him?
That he's nice to women.
Yeah, that he has a tender and emotional side, even though most of the time it's hidden away. Now, as I've been trying to suggest, the 50s is really a moment when various gender ideals are being worked out for men. And so you have the image of James Dean, and it coexists with the image of Burt Lancaster. Very different image, but maybe not completely different. Move ahead. Paul Newman, Somebody Up There Likes Me. Then we move into the 60s. Who's that? James Bond, right? Sean Connery early on. We'll move ahead. What scene's this from? What film? Yes, of course, it's the last scenes from The Graduate with Dustin Hoffman, a very, very different image of masculinity. What's different about Dustin Hoffman? He's not handsome, right? I mean, by any conventional standards. What else about him?
He's short and skinny, too.
And what else would you make of this character?
He's kind of indecisive. He's not really a take charge like most of the male leads were.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different kind of image of masculinity. There are moments in Hollywood when you have tremendous creativity in images. Here's another image from Hollywood. Who are these people? What film is this from? Easy Rider. Dennis Hopper, Peter Fonda, and who else is there in the back? Jack Nicholson. What image of masculinity does this send? And is it a new image or an old image?
Once again, it looks like the rebel all over again.
Yeah, it's man as rebel. And this is very much a movie that treats women as objects. It's about men living apart. It's very much an older image of masculinity, even though the dress is much more modern. Okay, our next image. What film is this from? Do you remember? Midnight Cowboy. Okay, Jon Voight and Dustin Hoffman again. I mean, this is not a standard portrayal of masculinity. It's about male prostitutes. But this was a brief moment in Hollywood history, one that would quickly disappear and be replaced by a very different image which has survived until today. Who's that? Clint Eastwood as Dirty Harry, right? Now we're pretty much back to William S. Hart, the early 20th century. Does he have a lot to say? Of course not. He speaks with his gun, just like William S. Hart that we saw at the very beginning. Or who's this next character? And what kind of image of masculinity does he seem to send out? He's the handsome, but not emotionally revealing male we've seen before. This is Richard Roundtree from a film that some of you may have seen, Shaft. They're going to make a remake of that quite soon. What image of masculinity is that? Tough, right? Of course, there are still other images of masculinity. Who's this? Woody Allen in Play It Again, Sam. And what image does he send of masculinity? Press your button, please.
Neurotic.
Neurotic. Obsessed with manliness, right? But he can't live up to it. He wants to be Bogart. He wants to be tough and swaggering, but he's incapable of that. I mean, everything about him is ill-suited for that masculine role. So what Woody Allen is doing in some ways is commenting about 100 years of images of masculinity. Okay, now let me make my argument to you. From the movies, we have all learned that a real man is tall and strong and silent. We have learned at the movies that he is violent, he is fierce, he is brutal. He's athletic and unrestrained. He's also tough and swaggering. Of course, Hollywood hasn't just sent out one image of masculinity. It sends out a variety of images. There's John Wayne in The Searchers. There's Clint Eastwood as Dirty Harry, and that's the image of man as tough, defiant, fearless, but also brutal, maniacal, with a rot of racial hatred. And then there's Sean Connery. It's James Bond. He's sophisticated, witty and charming, but there's also another side to Sean Connery, and that is sadistic and violent, which has been lost in the later James Bond movies. That's, I think, why Connery was so popular in a way that none of the subsequent Bonds have ever been, because he got the two-sided aspects of Bond's character exactly right. Then there's James Dean, rebel without a cause. He's sensitive, vulnerable, directionless, alienated, emotionally complex. Especially in recent years, however, manhood in the movies has been emotionally impoverished. Man is not nurturer. His closest bonds are invariably with other men, not with women. No one could imagine James Bond or Dirty Harry as a father surrounded by toddlers. Today's films, in particular, are saturated with male sexual fantasy. James Bond is carelessly promiscuous. His partners are grateful for his favors. They're easily satisfied and content to be left behind. So let's talk a little bit about the construction of masculinity in film. It's easy for us to poke fun at Marilyn Monroe. We look at her image and we see a manufactured human being, a product of plastic surgery and hair dye. And it's common in our culture to deplore the woman star with her silicone breasts, her nose jobs, and her facelifts. But, of course, Hollywood's image of men is similarly shaped and chiseled and reformed according to the Hollywood image. Clark Gable didn't want us to see his ears sticking out, so his ears were pinned back, and he had false teeth. James Dean also had false teeth. Alan Ladd had to stand on boxes so he would look taller than the women who starred in his films. Errol Flynn had a nose job. We're familiar with all of this about actresses, and we're not familiar at all about this with actors. How come that is? What's going on? How come in one case we're aware and these other cases we're not aware? And is this an accident that we know it about actresses and we don't know it about actors? What do you think? In Hollywood, it's okay for the female image to be seen as constructed, but it is not okay to see the masculine image as constructed. It is supposed to be authentic. It is supposed to be, quote unquote, real. But in fact, it's artificial, just like the female image in Hollywood. Henry Fonda wore a toupee. George Raft wore elevator shoes. Marlon Brando, at least before his recent films, wore a corset to conceal his bulk. John Garfield changed his name from Julius Garfinkel. Kirk Douglas changed his name. Paul Muni changed his name. In other words, we developed a certain image of masculinity at the movies, but it wasn't real. But we had the sense it was real. We had a sense that there were really people out there named Kirk Douglas, had male names. That there were men named John Wayne, and they looked like John Wayne. We didn't get the sense that these were manufactured, that these were, as we would say these days, cultural constructs. They're images, not realities. Hollywood has, as I've said, produced a variety of images of manhood. Bogart, Brando, Cary Grant, even Woody Allen. But one image has predominated over all, and that is man as self-controlled, invulnerable, and stoical. The ideal man is strong, competent, and unencumbered by effeminate introspection. He represents an image of unfeeling masculinity. A real man shows no signs of weakness. As John Wayne put it in The Shootist, I won't be wronged, I won't be insulted, I won't be laid a hand on. And for every 10-year-old boy who goes to the movies, these were the images of masculinity that were implanted in their brain. Now, for ordinary men, the heroic image of a John Wayne gives you a kind of release. But it also makes ordinary men feel small and timid by comparison. And after a while, the movie stars began to shape their own images so that they could never look different from that. So Clark Gable was given a role. He was supposed to play a priest. He wouldn't play a priest because a priest wasn't manly enough. So he had to have the role changed to that of preacher. Robert Redford vetoed a scene in The Way We Were where he was supposed to be drunk and unable to make love. But that would conflict with his image, right? That he's always able to perform sexually on demand. Paul Newman refused to play a homosexual coach in a film called The Front Runner because this would undermine his image. So it's not just screenwriters who help to shape this image of masculinity. After a while, actors themselves became convinced that they could not deviate from this image of masculinity without destroying their own careers. Every culture has norms that define what is masculine and what is feminine. Our films have served to promote certain dominant images of manliness. Men, according to Hollywood, are not supposed to possess those qualities that we call feminine. They're not supposed to possess intuition or tenderness or affection for children. In short, Hollywood seems to prefer the caveman definition of masculinity, not the new man definition of masculinity. And so we need to ask some questions about this. This is not the only image of manhood available in our culture, but Hollywood, for a variety of reasons, has decided to promote this image. And so we're going to have to ask why. Why do films promote certain stereotypes about manhood? Who benefits from the dominance of these images, of masculinity? And what ultimately are the consequences of those images? So let me ask you first, why does Hollywood promote those particular images of manhood? Any thoughts? Why not others? I thought that Hollywood was controlled by liberals who would more prefer the emotionally connected man, the tender-hearted man. How come those images aren't there? What do you think?
Because these images have worked before to sell the product, the movie, so they just keep using them with very slight modifications.
So these are images that clearly strike chords in the audience. And who makes up the audience mainly? The contemporary audience? Young men. And they want certain images, and Hollywood's happy to produce those images. Who benefits then from the dominance of these images? I mean, images don't just exist out there. Somebody benefits from them. Who is that, do you think? Any thoughts? Yes.
Men.
And how? Any thoughts about that?
Well, if they're constantly being portrayed as dominant and women as subservient, then they're obviously going to be in a position of power in their, normal lives.
I think that's a really interesting and, I think, accurate explanation for this. And finally, what's the consequence of all this, of having these certain images? Does it make any difference? Are these just fantasies projected on the screen that don't really make all that much difference? I mean, everyone knows they're not going to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger unless they take lots of steroids. Are they mere fantasies, or do they have impact? Any thoughts?
Well, some women are going to think that men should look like that, so now men have to live up to that stereotype too. Ordinary men have to live up to that stereotype of being non-emotional, very athletic, and have big muscles.
No, it's very interesting. I do think that these images are extremely powerful. Now let's look a little bit closely at some of the aspects of masculinity according to Hollywood. One aspect is violence. It is an important characteristic of Hollywood's image of manliness. Film after film insists that the masculine man acts without a moment's hesitation. Silence, solitariness, and freedom from domestic commitments, these also define the Hollywood hero. Most movies portray men in competition with other men. Competition over women, competition over status, competition over money, competition over power. In other words, what I'm trying to suggest to you is that movies, like education, have a hidden curriculum, that they're teaching you certain lessons, not explicitly. No one would listen. They do it much more subtly, and they do it again and again. Much movie violence expresses the rage men feel over the diminution of masculinity that they suffer in their lives. So what I would argue is that this represents what a Freudian might call a kind of reaction formation. As men feel less masculine in their everyday lives, the images of masculinity on the screen become more and more intense. We'll talk about that in just a few moments. Movies create a world wholly unlike the one we actually inhabit. Movies portray a world in which physical strength counts for everything. If you try to use physical strength in our society, you're going to be in jail, and you're certainly going to get sued. But in Hollywood, that's no problem. It's also a world where men are free of family responsibilities, of mortgages, of dental bills. Okay, another characteristic of the male hero is, of course, silence. The male hero is laconic. The male hero is taciturn. The male hero is unexpressive. The silence of the male hero dates at least from the Virginian. He is a man of action. He scorns analysis. He may be able to throw out quick wit, but he's not a person who agonizes over things. A fear and distrust of women is another characteristic of the male hero. And while this has always been the case, it seems to have actually intensified since World War II. During the post-war period, career women were increasingly replaced by pure objects of sex, like Marilyn Monroe or Jane Mansfield. Women are often treated as objects or with scorn. Women are often viewed as emasculating and predatory. They are a threat to manhood. They weaken masculine resolve. They are viewed as making impossible sexual and emotional demands. So you have male bonding as a very important aspect of the movies, coupled with a rejection of women. Male bonding is, of course, typified by the cowboy and his sidekick, but now it often takes the form of two detectives who work together. Roy Rogers has Gabby Hayes, the Lone Ranger has Tonto, John Wayne has Walter Brennan. This resembles the pre-adolescent bonding of young males. Male bonding is seen as necessary for survival in a hostile environment. Now, of course, it's hard for us, if we've taken Psych 101, not to look at those relationships and think that there's something going on. Those relationships, of course, involve a great deal of sexual repression. These men indulge in excessive displays of machismo to convince everyone that despite their exclusively male grouping, they are really heterosexual. And I suspect that there is a relationship between the all-male groupings that they're in and the mindless violence that's expressed. Even work is treated as if it too were a kind of warfare involving struggles for success, recognition, and ultimately for supremacy. So what about masculinity in films today? Violence in the older films of the Western was presented as necessary because the West was not yet tamed, because the system of justice in the West had been corrupted by evil and greedy men. But today, the hero must take the law into his own hands because our society is too civilized. The law is too compassionate of the criminal. And so the hero must be more violent than the society around him. The hero can only protect civilization through vigilante violence. And so he also avoids any domestic entanglements that might weaken him. What I want to do now before the break is just briefly talk about a series of crises of masculinity that men have experienced and that have then shaped the images of masculinity on the screen. If men were tough, they wouldn't have to show tough guys on the screen. It's because men feel threatened that they show images of tough guys on the screen. As the 20th century dawned, as we talked about in our very first class, many men were afraid that they had lost their virility and they had lost their vigor. Several factors contributed to this sense that men were losing their masculinity. Birth rates were falling. Economic independence was declining. Fewer men worked for themselves. Many felt that the urban environment was softening men. There was also a sense that working indoors under artificial lighting, that this was unnatural. But the final challenge, the greatest challenge to masculinity, came from changes in women's roles. Women were invading the male workplace. Women were entering colleges. Women were taking part in sports. Women were demanding the vote. Women were also attacking male-only bastions of recreation, like saloons, pool halls. And we've talked earlier about the images of womanhood that grew up in response to this, the vamp and the child woman. What kind of images of masculinity would you expect, given those fears about the loss of masculinity? I mean, we know what images they produced of women. What images would they produce of men? Okay. Men need to be tough. They need to be athletic. Sports, wilderness adventures and fighting. Douglas Fairbanks, athletic and urbane, he symbolized the new man. But of course, the most powerful image was the slow-talking, silent cowboy. So in fantasy, men were able to resolve this first crisis of masculinity. Let's take a break, and then we'll move on.